Well, it is good to see you once again this morning. I was wondering if I was actually going to be up here. Mark had grabbed the mic and had it on. And I was like, well, I don't know if I'm doing this or not. But I asked him, and he gave it over, so that was nice of him to do. Well, we come this morning once again to the Gospel according to Mark. So if you will, turn to Mark chapter 15. We'll be looking at verses 33 through 39 once again. And we're going to be focusing on those verses and trying to go as word by word as we can. If you were here last week, you may recall we spent almost the entire time talking on one aspect of the crucifixion of Christ. It was the darkness that came over the land for a span of 3 hours, from noon until 3. And I have to admit, this sermon is going to have probably a different tone because it's different subjects. It may not be as dark as last week's was. Thank you. But as we looked at the darkness last week, maybe some of you have thought about that before. Maybe it was brand new to you. That the darkness, that we noticed a few things. First of all, the darkness was not the absence of God. There was nothing in the world that was happening at that time that was more important, that was more necessary or more vital. You know, when we read the crucifixion story, sometimes we just skim over it, perhaps a little too quickly, and we fail to understand and we fail to appreciate everything that was happening. And we fail to appreciate what is actually taking place. You see, the crucifixion of Christ, this time frame of 6 hours, was the event where every event in history that had ever happened before, and every future event that would happen after, all of that hinges on this moment. And we understand through the revelation of Scripture that the crucifixion of Christ was the plan of God from eternity past. Everything God had done, creating the universe, forming man, casting Adam and Eve out of the garden because of their sin, yet in grace, sacrificing an animal to clothe them, sending the flood, scattering the people at Babel, choosing Abraham, increasing Israel, freeing them from the Egyptians, giving them the law, guiding them into the promised land, setting up judges and then a kingdom, sending the word of the prophets, sending the tribes of Israel off into captivity into foreign lands because of their disobedience, bringing them back to the land, allowing the Romans to occupy the territory, and all the types and shadows that God used in the Old Testament. All of those things led to this moment. Everything else that was going on in the world paled in comparison to what was happening on Golgotha's hill. And since that is the case, I wonder what the real scene at the cross looked like. It's easy for us to imagine the people there, some weeping, some in shocked silence, others mocking Jesus, yelling at Him, laughing at Him. But what about the things that are unseen? If this was the most important event in the entire existence of mankind, where do you think Satan was? We've already seen him in the events leading up to the crucifixion. A year or so prior to this day, he tried to steer Jesus away from the cross. When he used Peter to tell Jesus that this death you're talking about by the hands of others will never happen. And remember the words, "Get behind me, Satan." It appears as if he wanted to keep Jesus from the cross. We see him again in the Passion Week. Enter Judas not once, but twice to influence the events. Once to make a deal with the chief priest to hand Jesus over, that's in Luke 22:3, and again at the Last Supper. And in these events, it seems Satan wants to speed the process along. At first, he wants to slow it down and prevent it, and now he wants to speed it along. Well, that would make an interesting study, don't you think? That might be a good question for Ask the Pastor on Wednesday night. But where do you think Satan and his legions of angels were at this moment of Jesus' crucifixion? You see, the demons recognized Jesus as the Holy One of God. They called him that when he encountered them. They knew who he was. Had Satan climbed on the cross to whisper in Jesus' ear, "You've lost"? Or was it to tempt him by agreeing with the crowd, or was he influencing the crowd? Come down from the cross. We don't know. But perhaps if we could have been there to see with spiritual eyes, maybe we would have seen Satan and all the demons there. And perhaps when the darkness came, maybe they caught a glimpse of what their destiny would be. Second, not only was the darkness not the absence of God, but we learned last week the darkness was the very presence of God. God had used darkness before to announce and to reveal His presence, and He did so with Abraham. And when he came in the darkness, He established a covenant with him. And He appeared at Mount Sinai to reveal Himself to Moses and the recently freed Israelites. And when He revealed Himself in the darkness, He established a covenant with them. And now we see the darkness again at Calvary. God had not left. He was revealing Himself in the darkness, and He was establishing a covenant, a new covenant with His people. And third, we learned that the darkness was evidence not only of the presence of God, but the punishment of God. God had used darkness in the past as judgment. And the prophet Amos described the future day of the Lord, a day of judgment, as darkness. Hell is described as darkness. And what we saw last week is that Christ took our hell upon Himself. He was in the wrathful presence of God and was in the punishment of God, enduring all of His Father's wrath and fury for the sin of His people. And this is why He cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Because He had taken the full brunt of God's wrath towards sin as He became sin for us. And at that time, God was present, but His face was against His Son, and He would not help Him. And this is what hell is like. And so this brings us to today's study. So we're going to continue looking at the details of Mark 15, 33 through 39. But I think it'd be beneficial to gather some more details concerning the context of the passage. There is a saying about contracts and advertisements on the radio or the television that the devil is in the details. Well, for our study this morning, I hope you see that the Lord is in the details. So what I'd like to do is read a larger portion of the text. And as I go through, I'm just going to be drawing out some details. Nothing super explanatory, just tidbits of information to help us grasp the bigger picture. And I kind of mentioned this on Wednesday night, reading the text and pulling out certain words so that it makes better sense of the context. And so we're going to start in actually Mark 15, verse 21, in order to see how all these events come together to take place for the most important event in human history. Verse 21. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. Now, the crossbeam would refer, the cross he's talking about would be the crossbeam. Crucifixion victims carried their cross, their own instrument of death. In a sense, they would carry it the rest of their lives. They had little time left. The cross identified the person. This is why Jesus teaches to pick up your cross daily. It proclaims your death. It identifies you, and you will carry that cross the rest of your life. This Simon was compelled, he was forced to participate in the carrying of the cross of Jesus. Jesus had been scourged, so he was struggling under the weight of the cross, and Simon carries it. but perhaps carrying it physically resulted in his spiritual rebirth. Mark, who is writing to a Roman audience, is very specific with these names. And perhaps these three men all became believers and were now known to the Roman church. There is a Rufus mentioned in Romans 16:13. Maybe this is the same person. As we go back to the text. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. Now Mark is translating the Aramaic for his Roman audience. We get our word Calvary from the Latin calva or calvaria, which means skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Myrrh was a painkiller, but a side effect was that it made one not as mentally sharp, much like many drugs today. And Jesus refused it because he wanted his mind to be clear, and he was going to face the wrath of God with no barriers of protection, as all in hell will do. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them, to decide what each should take. So with crucifixion, it's simply stated here, they crucified him. With crucifixion, they placed nails in between the ulna and the radius in the wrist. If you know anything about your body, the radius runs from your thumb up, and then if you rotate it over, it radiates over the ulna. And they would put the nails in the wrist, not in the hands, because it would rip through the hands, through the metacarpals. And so it's placed in between the ulna and the radius in the wrist to keep the body on the cross. And when they lifted the cross up, it would slide quickly into a hole, and the violent impact could force the shoulders out of joint. This fulfills Psalm 22:14, 16, and 18, where David, 1,000 years before the crucifixion, writes this, I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. They have pierced my hands and feet. They divide my garments among them. And for my clothing, they cast lots. Back to the text, verse 25. And it was the third hour when they crucified him. It's 9 a.m. And the inscription of the charge against him read, the King of the Jews. Now this charge against Jesus was a true statement. Remember, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the religious leaders, they didn't like this statement. They told Pilate, why don't you put this? Why don't you say, he claims to be this? This is what he said about himself. And Pilate says, no, I'm putting it like this. This is the way it's going to be. The statement was a true statement. He is the King of the Jews. The charges of offense were placed on the cross with the criminal. And Paul used this idea in Colossians 2:14 when he stated that the record of debt that stood against us was nailed to the cross. Everything that you've done, everything that's against you, everything that's against God has been nailed to the cross. That is your sign. All that you've done, all your sin, all your shame has been nailed to the cross. And with him they crucified two robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads. This fulfills Psalm 22:7. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. And they were saying, aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. This was a reference to what Jesus said about his own body in John 2:19. It was also a charge that they brought up against him in Mark 14:58. They continued to say, save yourself and come down from the cross. So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, he saved others. He cannot save himself. Once again, we see a fulfillment of Psalm 22:8, where David writes the words of the Lord's enemies as, he trusts in the Lord, let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. And then they continue. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe. They would not have believed. What would they have done? They probably would have said that he was empowered by Satan to come down from the cross. They would not have believed. And those who crucified with him also reviled him. We see here in Mark that both criminals reviled him. So this places us now in our main text. So we reviewed 33 and 34, so let's begin at verse 35. Some of the bystanders hearing it said, "Behold, he's calling for Elijah." And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." So the bystanders are there because crucifixions happened at public places. Many times they were placed near roads to warn people coming to a city or town about breaking the law. And so as you were driving through on your animal of some sort and you're riding into town, it would not be a surprise for you to see people hanging there alive on crosses as you come into town. This was Roman's way of saying, you better not do anything wrong or this could be you. And so it was a warning. But it was also put on public roads and places like that so that the one who was crucified could be an extra victim and be victimized by those whom he victimized. And what would happen is that the people could come by and insult the person, they could spit on the person, they could throw things at the crucified person, and the one crucified could do nothing about it. This was all legal in Rome. This particular bystander either misunderstands what Jesus is saying, or it is a type of mockery. Notice what Jesus is saying, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani." And he says, look, he's calling for Elijah. The name of God in Aramaic is Eloi, and Elijah is Eliah. So there is some similarity. And with Jesus being beaten and scourged, crucified, suffering the wrath of God, some people think, well, his words may have been misconstrued because he's weakened, and it's affected his speech somewhat. Well, concerning this more of being a mockery, Elijah was considered by the Jewish people a forerunner of the Messiah. And he was also considered a deliverer of those who were in trouble. Therefore, they taunt him, because Jesus is in trouble. And they all say that he's calling on Elijah to help. And if Jesus were the Messiah, Elijah would come to help. And if he doesn't come to help, then that would mean that Jesus was not the Messiah. So this whole act, he's calling on Elijah, I think is a mockery. And this instigates someone getting a sponge filled with sour wine and putting it on a reed to give to Jesus. This sour wine was a mixture of wine vinegar, and it was diluted with water. Now, this was a drink which was a common beverage for laborers, day laborers, and for soldiers. It was inexpensive, didn't cost a whole lot to make, and it also relieved thirst more efficiently than water by itself. So this event most likely ties in with Jesus saying, "I thirst," one of the 7 sayings from the cross, and receiving the sour wine. And we find that in John 19, 28 through 30. So we do not know if a bystander put the sponge of sour wine on a reed and gave it to Jesus, or if it was the soldier who did this. The intention, however, may not have been an act of kindness. Rather, it was another act of mockery, because the sour wine, unlike the myrrh mixture, would actually refresh Jesus and would act as a stimulant and would make his mind clearer, and therefore it would keep him alive longer. We tend to forget in the crucifixion, because we think of the crucifixion of Christ, that it just took a short time. Most crucifixion victims lasted for days, to the point that if they didn't die from asphyxiation, which is what would happen, they would take a breath in and they couldn't breathe it out and they suffocate, that the birds of the air would come and start pecking at them and taking off pieces of skin or taking out their eyes. That was crucifixion. So we don't know what they're trying to do here, but I think they're trying to keep him alive just a little bit longer. So maybe it was an act of mercy, or maybe it was just an act to prolong his torture. By the way, an interesting thing here. And when it says they put a sponge on the reed, The reed which they used to give Jesus something to drink from is the same word used to describe the reed which they used to strike Jesus on the head in Mark 15:19. I wonder if the same stick they used to beat him was used to approach his face one more time as another attempt to torture him. I think Mark hints at the idea that this was not an act of mercy, but an act of mockery to prolong his pain because of the statement in verse 36, "Wait, let's see whether Elijah will come to take him down. Let's let him live a little bit longer so we can see if this happens." And in verse 37 we read this, "And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last." There are two statements Jesus gives right before his death. In the first statement he says, "It is finished," or "paid in full." That's in John 19:30. Imagine if when you buy a car and you finally pay it off and you get your certificate that you've paid it off, and then you attempt to go pay another payment the next month, and the bank looks at you like you're crazy. Like, what are you doing? I'm making a car payment. Well, why would you do that? It's paid in full. You can't add to this anymore. It's done. It's paid. It's over. It's paid in full. This is what Jesus is saying. When he dies on the cross and he says it's paid in full, in that amount of time he takes the full brunt of God's wrath, he takes the full brunt of his punishment, and he takes your full brunt of punishment, and he does it for you, and there's nothing you can do to add to your holiness except the holiness that he gives. That's all it is. It's his. You can't add to it. You can't pay more to it. You can't repay it. It's yours by what he did. It is paid in full. In the second statement he makes, Luke tells us this in his gospel in 23:46. "Then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, 'Father, into your hands I commit my spirit.' And having said this, he breathed his last." So this is probably the loud cry Mark is referencing. This is a momentous statement, for it shows that the relationship between Father and Son has not changed. Yes, he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But now he calls him Father. God is still there. God is still there. The Father is his name. Jesus is still the Son. The relationship was not broken. Jesus, according to John, bowed his head and gave up his spirit. He was in total control of his death. No one took his life. He gave it. And this was the death for the covenant. This was a death to condemn sin, to display God's presence, to display his punishment. But yet this death for the covenant was also a death to consecrate, to set those for whom Christ died apart to holiness. And we see this in Mark 15:38. This is what Mark writes. "And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom." Now there were two curtains in the temple at Jerusalem. The first curtain hung before the court of Israel and the holy place. The court of Israel, you had the court of women and Gentiles, and you had the court of Israel. This contained a small area inside of the courtyard that contained the altar for burnt offerings. Now, Jewish men could be in the court of Israel, but it was the priests, only the priests were allowed to enter into the holy place, where one would find a table of bread and a lampstand and an altar of incense. This was the temple, copied from, of course, the tabernacle. And the priests would go in there. This curtain, according to the historian Josephus, was a Babylonian tapestry, and it depicted the earth and the sea and the heavens. Basically, what it's typifying is the universe. Now, that's the first curtain. But there was a second curtain, and it hung between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. And the Holy of Holies was only entered once per year by the high priest on the Day of Atonement. Now, Mark does not seem to indicate which curtain was torn. If it were the first curtain, this would have been a more public display than the inner curtain, because they couldn't see that one. But the tearing of the second curtain would have greater theological meaning. So which one was torn? I think we have a clue. The word Mark uses for curtain was used by ancient authors to describe both curtains, but it was used more frequently to describe the curtain between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. The writer of Hebrews helps us out when he uses this same word that Mark uses in chapter 6:19 in reference to the curtain which leads into the inner place. He uses it again in 9:3 where he describes the curtain leading to the most holy place. And he uses it in 10:20 in which he references the curtain as being Jesus' flesh, which allows us access to God. The Septuagint also makes a distinction between the curtains. The veil that led into the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle in Exodus 26:31 through 37 is identified by the same word Mark uses here, whereas the veil that led into the holy place from the outside is identified by a different word in Exodus 27. So in all those ways, it seems to identify the curtain which was torn was the one which led to the Holy of Holies. Therefore, what we see in Mark's writing is that when Jesus died, the curtain that led to the holy place, the curtain which separated what was understood as the dwelling place of God, this Holy of Holies, and it was a place that was away from the outsiders. But this one was torn in two. And what do we have with that? Access to God was opened. The death of the covenant was a death to consecrate, to set us apart for holiness. And His death accomplishes this by making the way to God accessible. It's interesting to note a couple of things about the tearing. The curtain was torn in two. This was not an incident that through the years and years of wear that the curtain just so happened to tear at the moment of Christ's death. There was all these little tears and stuff, and just because something happened, it just tears by itself. No, it was torn in two. This is an active event. What we have to remember is that this curtain is 3.5 inches thick. It is 30 foot high, and it was torn not from somebody at the bottom, but from top to bottom. This was not a man who did this. This was an action of God who was showing the priests, and some of those priests spread the word for others to know, that no longer was access to Him limited to once a year with the blood sacrifice. Access to God had been opened for all time to those who were sanctified by the blood of the perfect sacrifice, by the blood of His own Son. So this death to consecrate made God accessible to us. But it also made us acceptable to Him. You see, the priests were forever working. They were constantly making sacrifices, trying to atone the people's sins. And those sacrifices could never fully atone for sin. You would have a sacrifice, you get your sins atoned for, and you go back to the house and you get angry about something and you sin again, and you're like, great, I got to do this all over. The writer of Hebrews says it this way: it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered, since the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sins? But in these sacrifices, there's a reminder of sins every year. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. So we know some of the chief priests were at the crucifixion. But some of the priests had a job to do. And they were at the temple. And this work that they're doing there shows us the perfect timing of Christ's death. The darkness lasted from 12 to 3. And at 3 o'clock, Jesus died. And at the same time of His death, the priests were preparing to slaughter the Passover lambs. Imagine the lambs being led to the slaughter, the noise of their bleating. And just as the knives were about to strike, the true Lamb of God cries out with a loud voice, and He dies, and the curtain was torn in two. God accepted the sacrifice. The writer of Hebrews speaks of this when he writes this: And every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, He sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until His enemies should be made a footstool for His feet. For by a single offering He has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. This death of the covenant is a death to consecrate. And with the death of Christ, God is now accessible to us, and we are acceptable to Him. So we've seen in the darkness a death to condemn. We see in the veil being torn a death to consecrate, to make God accessible, to make us acceptable. Now let's look at another characteristic of Jesus' death. It was a death to convert. The first conversion we see is in verse 39. It's a Roman centurion. Verse 39, Mark writes this, "And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, 'Truly, this man was the Son of God.'" Now the wording here is interesting, because the centurion is identified as the one who stood facing him. Now, while it's easy to imagine the centurion standing in front of the cross, watching Christ, watching all the events take place, that word for "in front of" carries with it a tone of opposition. That word means opposite, but it can mean, and is many times translated as opposed or contrary. So one could use this word to describe someone who is antagonistic. So what we have here is not a soldier who had heard about Jesus and participated in the crucifixion of Christ unwillingly because he knew who Jesus really was. No, what we have is someone who was most likely opposed to Christ, and one who was simply doing his job as he had done probably hundreds of times before. We have a centurion who knew the way criminals acted in society and how they acted on the cross. And he'd seen death before. He was used to it. There's something different with the death of Christ. So much so that the one who stood before him, who stood opposite of him, and most likely stood against everything Jesus taught, that person was changed. Mark quotes him as saying, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." He had been there for the darkness. He had seen the way Jesus acted. He had heard the 7 statements from the cross. And in that little span of 6 hours, something happened to him. He came to realize that this man's death was different because the man himself was different. Here you have a centurion who was in a place of authority. He commanded 100 people. That's where we get the name centurion. He's a man of order. He's a man of discipline. Not only does he have authority over many, but he's a man under authority as well. And he leads when he's supposed to lead, and he submits when he's called to do so. He is loyal to his country. He fights for it. He defends its honor. But there was something wrong in this man of order. And as he gazes upon Christ, the one whom he opposed, perhaps he realized that the order and the discipline he thought he possessed was all just now chaos. And perhaps he realized the authority he had was really just an illusion. Perhaps as he looked at the face of Jesus, he realized that his loyalties were misguided and misplaced. Luke tells us the centurion gives another statement. Now, there's no reason to think that these are contrary statements. The centurion simply said both of them. Luke writes in 23:47 of his gospel, "Now, when the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God, saying, 'Certainly this man was innocent.'" Or as some translations have it, "Truly this man was a righteous man." Matthew tells us that at the time of Christ's death, an earthquake occurred. And he states in 27:54, when the centurion and those who were with him keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and what it took place, they were filled with awe and said, truly, this was the Son of God. So we see the Roman centurion was changed. But there were other soldiers under his authority that were changed as well. So what we have here is a fuller picture of the event. The centurion has seen and heard the mockery of the crowd, the way Christ acted. He heard the statements of Jesus from the cross, the way Jesus cried out with a loud voice, a confident, triumphant voice, and how He died when He wanted to die, and He saw the earthquake. It is then when He says, certainly this man was innocent, truly, this man was the Son of God. Now, the use of the term Son of God is particularly interesting. Several of you have studied or are currently studying the Gospel according to Mark, and you may have noticed a particular theme. Now, the Gospel of Mark focuses a lot on the actions of Jesus, and it provides us a main theme. If you go to seminary and Bible college and those things, they will tell you that the main theme of Mark is Jesus as the servant. Okay? But one cannot help but notice there is a thread that runs through the book of Mark. Yes, Jesus is the servant, but the thread that keeps popping up and running through Mark is Christ's deity. It runs throughout the book. Mark has used the phrase Son of God, or words alluding to that relationship several times in his writing. In chapter 1, verse 11, God the Father tells Jesus at His baptism, "You are my beloved Son." In chapter 3, verse 11, the unclean spirits cry out to Jesus, "You are the Son of God." In 9:7, at the Transfiguration, the Father says about Jesus, "This is my beloved Son." In chapter 14, verse 61, the high priest asked Jesus, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus responds with, "I am." In all these cases of the use of the phrase Son of God, or something close to it, no human being in the book of Mark has yet declared Jesus as the Son of God. Now you might be thinking, whoa, wait a minute. Peter called Jesus the Christ, the Son of the living God, and if you read that where he says that, you are the Christ, the Son of the God, the living one. That's how specific he is. And you say, well, Peter did it. He did, but it's not written that way in Mark. Mark simply records Peter's confession in chapter 8, verse 29 as, "You are the Christ." Mark, whose writing, as Justin Martyr would call it, the memoirs of Peter, who perhaps is simply writing down a sermon Peter preached in Rome, shows this Roman audience to whom he's writing that the first person, the first human being to declare what has been the thread running throughout the gospel, that Jesus is the Son of God, that human being is a Roman centurion, a Gentile. The Roman centurion gives us a preview of things to come. For the first several years of the church, the fellowship was mainly Jewish. But that would change. Peter would preach to the Gentiles, and they would be converted and have the same like faith as the apostles. So this death was a death to convert. So we've seen the conversion of the Roman centurion, but now we get to see the conversion of the reviling criminal. So for this aspect, we need to go back and look at verses 27 and 32 in chapter 15 of Mark. And Mark writes this in verse 27, "And with him they crucified two robbers, one in his right hand and one on his left. And then in 32, those who were crucified with him also reviled him." So both of them are doing it. The word robbers here is another interesting word. The word could be translated revolutionaries or insurrectionists. Josephus used the word to describe the zealots. You remember the zealots, right? Those people that were national people. They loved their country, and so they were just professional assassins of Roman citizens or Roman political leaders, or even tax collectors. I've said this before maybe in some studies, but can you imagine when Matthew's called to be a disciple and Simon the Zealot is there? How much sleep do you think Matthew got the first couple of months? Not much. Because the zealots would have knives and they would go through and they would stab people in the back, through the lungs and into the heart, and put the knife back up and walk away like that. And the person would fall, and they were those assassins. That's who the zealots were. They were insurrectionists, and that's what Josephus calls them. It is the same word here that's used for robber. So if this is the case, if these two were insurrectionists, then they may have been part of the insurrection of which Barabbas participated. Barabbas, as you may recall, was in Matthew's account, as he calls him, a notorious prisoner. Mark says that Barabbas was among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection. Luke describes him as one who was in prison for insurrection and murder. John calls him a robber. Same word. So if John is using the word robber to describe Barabbas as a thief, then he is a thief plus an insurrectionist and a murderer. Now if John is using the word to point out that Barabbas is just a revolutionary, then he's only guilty of insurrection and murder and not robbing someone. Either way, he's not good. Whichever way you look at it, Barabbas was a rebel and a murderer, and he was the one called for by the people to be released instead of Jesus. Remember? Who will you want for me to release? Pilate asked, and they're saying, we want Barabbas instead of Jesus. They wanted a murderer instead of the one who raised people from the dead. This is who they wanted. So Jesus, in a sense, took Barabbas' place. Interestingly, if the two robbers crucified with Jesus were part of Barabbas' band of rebels, then Jesus is taking Barabbas' place as the central figure and leader of these insurrectionists. That's why he's in the middle. They planned it that way, another form of mockery. But whatever the case is with these two robbers, we know that this event fulfills Isaiah 53:12, where the prophet writes about the suffering servant of God, he was numbered with the transgressors. So Matthew tells us in 27 verses 43 and 44 of his gospel account that the people were saying, he trusts in God, let God deliver him now if he desires him, for he said, I am the Son of God. And the robbers, plural, who were crucified with him also reviled him in the same way. Matthew leaves it at that. He does not mention any change that happened with the robbers. This is not surprising because as we talked about the theme of Mark being Jesus is the servant, there's a theme of Matthew as well. And the theme of Matthew is that Jesus is the rejected Messiah and King. He's rejected. So Matthew doesn't talk about conversions of anyone on the cross because it fits his theme. Now there's nothing wrong with that because we know it happened, but Matthew's not mentioning it. So Mark, in a similar way, does not mention any conversion of one of the robbers, and neither does John. It is left to Luke to tell us the complete story. Both robbers were reviling Christ. They were mocking him. They were both berating him, just as the chief priests and the elders were doing. But Luke shows us that in those hours on the cross, something happened. And as the blood trickled down the cross, grace began to flow. And Luke mentions this event most likely because it fits a major theme of his gospel account. Christ's compassion and acceptance of the outcast. That's the theme of Luke. And Luke writes in 23:39 through 43, one of the criminals who were hanged railed at him saying, are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us. But the other rebuked him, saying, do you not fear God, since you're under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. And he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he said to him, truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Both robbers railed against Jesus at the beginning. Both of them reviled him. Now one of them rebukes the other for his words against Jesus. Why? Perhaps this one saw the inscription above the Lord's head, which in its entirety, combining the phrasing from all four Gospels, said this: "This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Maybe the robber saw how Jesus acted. He heard his words that Jesus said. Maybe he heard the silence of Jesus as he was mocked and ridiculed. And maybe he just thought, this Jesus, this Savior, for that's what the name Jesus or Yeshua means, this Jesus from Nazareth, that poor, rejected, and despised town, if he is who he says he is, and he is who they say he is, the King of the Jews, then maybe he can save a despised, rejected, outcast like me. Maybe it happened that way. But we do not know exactly what happened, but we do know the grace of the Lord opened his eyes to see and gave him a new life. And as he pushed up to get another breath, this time it was truly his first breath as someone who recognized his own sin, his own due punishment. He recognized the identity of Jesus and his ability to save, and he uses that breath to say, "Remember me." What a tremendous change in this man. And it's a lesson for all of us. At first, the criminal berated Jesus and only wanted Jesus to save him from the physical need that he had. But in just a moment of time, the robber realized that he was not going to get out of this situation alive. That's very much like us, isn't it? Death is coming. It can't be avoided. You're not going to get out of this alive. It's a bridge we all have to cross. You know, many people see Jesus as a cure to some of their physical needs, but when we truly realize who Jesus is, that his kingdom is greater than our current physical desire, that's when we humbly plead with him, "Lord, just remember me." You see, Jesus' death for the covenant was a death to convert. One was a Roman centurion. He's disciplined. He's submissive to authority. He's confident in his own authority. He's a soldier. He's a loyal subject of Rome. He cared for the 100 men under his care. He was a man of order and maturity. The other was a robber, a thief, and perhaps an insurrectionist. He's not disciplined. He subverted authority. Perhaps he was a fighter, but because he's a thief, maybe he's more prone to flee. He's disloyal to Rome. He cared only for himself. He was a man of chaos and immaturity. Two completely opposite people. But in reality, they were the same. They were both lost and in need of a Savior. Both of them believed Jesus to be who he truly was, the King of the Jews and the Son of God. And it all happened in a span of hours. And their lives were changed. One only had a little bit of time left. We don't know what happened to the other. Perhaps we can all see ourselves in these two. Maybe you're the organized one. You're the disciplined one. Or maybe you're guided by your emotions and you're undisciplined. Maybe you're the one in authority and you care for those under your watch, or maybe you see some selfish tendencies in how you act. Perhaps these two are the two ends of a spectrum and everyone else is in a conglomerate of these characteristics. We've heard it said that we're all different. This is true to an extent. I love one of the signs that I saw. I wanted it for my room, my classroom. I never got it. It says, "You are unique, just like everybody else." You know, even if you're just one in a million, that just means that there, at this moment on the earth, 7,000 people just like you. We are different. There's many differences. But when it comes to people today, just like there were with the centurion and the robber, what unites those who are outside of Christ is that they are contrary to Him, and they revile Him, and they ridicule Him, and they reject Him. That's what makes the lost the same. Whether they do act and say things contrary to Christ actively or passively, they still do so. And yet what unites those in Christ, no matter the background, is the realization of our true nature, our due penalty of sin, and the realization that Jesus is Savior and King. His death was a death to convert, and He continues to do so exceedingly well by His extravagant grace. So the death of Jesus was a death for the covenant. It was a death to condemn. It displayed the presence of God and the punishment of God. It was a death to consecrate. God is now accessible to us and we are acceptable to Him. It was a death to convert both the Roman centurion and the reviling criminal. But all of these attributes of the death of Christ would mean nothing if His death was not a death to conquer. Jesus died in order to rise again. And without the resurrection, Jesus is just another dead man. He may have been a great teacher by some respects, but if there is no resurrection, then He's simply a liar and therefore not a great teacher. And if there is no resurrection, Jesus is just a crazy man declaring Himself to be God. If there is no resurrection, then our faith is in vain and we are to be pitied because we're misrepresenting God. And we might as well just never come back here again because we're trusting in something that's not real. Yet, because Jesus is risen, this death conquers. And it conquers sin. It pays the price for sin and removes the power of sin. When Christ died, you died with Him. When He was risen, you were raised with Him. Your sin was imputed to Him and His righteousness was imputed to you. The wages of sin is death, and Christ received that payment for you, and He took your due reward. And the price for sin is an eternal death and an everlasting existence in the darkness in the presence of God, suffering the rightful punishment of God. But it is that death of Christ that pays that price, and it's paid in full. And apart from Christ, there is no access to God. We are unacceptable in His sight. But the death of Christ opens access to God, makes us acceptable unto Him, and His resurrection proves it. And apart from Christ, we either attempt to live life by a set of rules, which makes us behave in a way that we can distinguish ourselves and we can impress our authorities or any authority by our works, or we live our lives as rebels against authority, believing we have a freedom to make up our own morality as we see fit. In either case, our works simply condemn us. But the death of Christ converts us to understand we are truly helpless without Him, and we understand what we truly deserve from Him, and we proclaim who He really is, the Son of God and the King who comes with the kingdom. Therefore, beloved, live in this kingdom. For the death of Christ not only pays the price of sin, but the power of sin. Sin shall not have dominion over you. If you believe in Him, if you trust in Him, if He has given you life, then beloved, live it. A death for the covenant, a new covenant, a death to condemn, a death to consecrate, a death to convert. And all this happens because His death conquers, because Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified, He has risen.